They eliminated the profit-sharing program. That's what he announced, right there in the middle of our end-of-year celebration, with the decorations still hanging and the cake half-eaten on the conference table. My team had just delivered the best fiscal year in the company's 31-year history. Not the best in a decade. The best. Ever. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 54, and I've been Director of Supply Chain Operations at Hargrove Medical Distribution for 18 years. I started as a logistics coordinator 2 weeks after my Army discharge, worked every rung of the ladder the honest way: night shifts, weekend runs, holiday coverage when nobody else would take it. I know every warehouse bay, every carrier contract, every vendor relationship we have by first name. I built this department from 11 people running out of a cramped back office to a 63-person operation that moves critical medical supplies to hospitals across 7 states. We had just closed the fiscal year at 312% above our efficiency targets. Not 50%, not 100%, 312%. We'd landed a long-term distribution contract with a regional hospital network covering 42 facilities. We had cut our error rate to 0.3%, which our industry benchmarks consider essentially impossible. The logistics director from our biggest competitor had actually called me personally to ask how we did it. I told him 18 years of hard work, and he laughed because he thought I was joking. I wasn't. So we gathered in the main conference room on a Thursday afternoon in December. Someone had ordered a sheet cake with record year written in blue frosting. Diane from warehouse management had brought sparkling cider. Ray, my operations lead for 11 years, was grinning so wide I could see every tooth in his head. These were good people who had given everything to make those numbers real. Then the CEO's son walked in. He was 31. He had a degree from Dartmouth that he worked into conversation with the casual frequency of a tick. He'd arrived 8 months earlier under the exact same arrangement these things always arrive. His father, our CEO and founder, had announced he was stepping back to focus on strategic vision, and his son would be observing and learning the operational side of the business. Just observing. Just learning. He stood at the head of the table like a man who had practiced this moment in the mirror. No hello, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of what this team had just accomplished. He straightened his jacket, the expensive kind that fits in a way regular jackets don't, and he smiled the particular smile of someone who believes discomfort is a management tool. I want to talk about something important, he said. He always called it something important when he was about to tell you something that benefited him and hurt everyone else. The room shifted. I felt it, that specific change in air pressure that happens when a group of people collectively sense bad news arriving disguised as good intentions. He said that the company had an incredible year. He said our numbers were outstanding. He said the team should be proud. And then, without changing his tone or his smile, he said that effective immediately, the annual profit-sharing program was being converted to a discretionary performance bonus structure with revised eligibility thresholds. Diane set down her cup of sparkling cider very carefully, like she was trying not to make any noise. Ray looked at the table. What that sentence meant, translated from the language he used into the language the rest of us speak, was this. The profit-sharing checks that this team had been counting on, the ones contractually tied to annual performance metrics, the ones some of my people had already factored into mortgage payments and college tuition deposits gone, replaced with something that would be handed out at his discretion to people he decided deserved it, according to criteria that didn't exist yet. We need to build a culture of excellence that isn't dependent on financial incentives, he continued, clasping his hands together like a professor who had just delivered the thesis statement of a lecture. Real motivation comes from purpose, not paychecks. We want people who are here for the mission. Diane blinked. She had worked 12-hour shifts in a refrigerated warehouse for the last 3 weeks to make our year-end delivery numbers. She was here for the mission and the paycheck, like every reasonable person on Earth. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I sat in my chair and I took a slow breath. And I looked at my coffee cup for a moment. Longer than necessary. Because something had happened 3 weeks earlier that the CEO's son didn't know about. 3 weeks before that meeting, I'd been doing what I always do at the end of the fiscal year, reviewing the full documentation archive, updating compliance records, pulling together the performance summary for the annual operations report. I go through everything. The Army taught me that. You review everything, you verify everything, you never assume someone else caught the detail you missed. I was working through the original department charter documents, the ones from when I'd formally taken the director role 15 years ago, and I found it, filed behind the standard employment exhibits, on page 11 of the annex to my operational authority agreement. A clause that had been written during a different era of this company, when the founder himself had drafted these agreements by hand and added provisions that reflected his actual values before he started stepping back and letting his son reshape everything in his image. The clause read, "In the event that annual supply chain efficiency metrics exceed 275% of baseline forecast under the direct operational leadership of the Director of Supply Chain, said director shall be granted full standing to present and vote on compensation and staffing decisions at the next scheduled board review, pending ratification by the founding shareholder." 275% of forecast. We had hit 312%. I had read that clause, closed the folder, and sat with it for a long time. Long enough for the building to go quiet around me. Long enough for the cleaning crew to finish the floor and leave. Long enough for me to understand exactly what I was holding. I hadn't told anyone. Not Ray, not Diane, not the attorney I'd called the next morning just to confirm the language was still enforceable. She'd confirmed it in about 45 seconds and then asked me, very carefully, if I needed anything else. I told her I'd be in touch. I'd waited. Patience is a thing the Army drills into you at a level that becomes involuntary. You don't move until the moment is right, and you know the moment is right because you've been watching and you've been ready, and when it comes, you don't hesitate. The CEO's son had just handed me the moment on the same table where the half-eaten cake was sitting. I looked up from my coffee cup and said, calmly, that I'd like to schedule a few minutes with him after this. He nodded, already visibly calculating that this was going to be an employee morale conversation he could deflect with a whiteboard and 3 buzzwords. The room cleared out in that particular way, where nobody makes eye contact with anyone. Ray paused near the door and looked at me. I gave him the smallest nod I had, the kind that means I know what I'm doing. He left. The CEO's son settled into the chair at the head of the table and pulled out his phone like he was already managing his time away from this inconvenience. "I understand people have feelings about the profit-sharing adjustment," he said without looking up. "But change is always uncomfortable. That's growth." I reached into the folder I'd brought with me and slid a document across the table. He looked at it the way people look at things they don't expect to have to look at. He picked it up. He started reading. I watched his expression move through several stages. The first stage was mild confusion. The second was the specific kind of rereading that happens when someone thinks they've misunderstood something. The third was a very careful stillness that told me he'd understood exactly right. "This is a 15-year-old document," he said. "It's my operational authority agreement," I said. "The annex is on page 11. The highlighted portion activates at 275% efficiency improvement under my direct leadership. Our number this year is 312%. The founding shareholder's signature is at the bottom." He set the document down with more control than I expected. He was trying to look unbothered, but his jaw had tightened in a way he didn't seem aware of. "Look," he said, "I respect that there's some old language in here that might seem relevant, but that's not how modern companies operate. The organizational structure has evolved. My father has stepped back. I'm overseeing operations now. And..." I reached into the folder and placed a second document next to the first. The board meeting schedule and the procedural charter for shareholder votes. I'd highlighted the relevant section. "The next quarterly review is in 3 weeks, I said. "Under the terms of the agreement, I have standing to present to the board. I've already confirmed the language with our legal department. Sarah has the paperwork ready." His name was what he reached for next. My first name. People reach for first names when they want to remind you of a relationship that should override what's written on paper. "Marcus," he said, "I think we're making this more complicated than it needs to be." This was obviously a legacy provision that was never seriously intended to. I gathered the documents and stood up. "Your father is joining the board meeting via phone," I said. "I reached out to him directly this morning. I think you should be there." I left him at the table with the cake and the empty cups and the specific expression of a person who has just realized that the ground they've been standing on belongs to someone else. I want to back up, because none of this started in December. It started in April, when the CEO's son arrived with his Dartmouth degree and his certainty and his complete absence of interest in understanding how anything actually worked. His father had run this company the right way for a long time. He had walked the warehouse floor. He had known the names of the drivers. He had understood that a medical distribution company lives or dies on one thing: getting the right product to the right place at exactly the right time, because on the other end of that shipment, someone is waiting on something they need to stay alive or recover or function. He had built a culture around that responsibility, and it showed in everything: the retention rate, the vendor relationships, the reputation we had with hospital procurement directors who had worked with us for 15 years and never looked at a competitor. Then came the health issues. Nothing catastrophic, he told us on a video call, just a cardiac situation that required reduced stress and monitored recovery. He was confident in the leadership structure, He was leaving the operational side in capable hands. He meant his son. His son arrived on a Monday and by Wednesday had already scheduled what he called a strategic culture alignment session, which was a meeting about how we should think about meetings. By Friday, he had announced that our reporting structure was going to be reorganized to improve synergy flow, a phrase I had to ask him to define twice before concluding that it meant nothing. He asked me, in our first one-on-one, whether I had considered integrating predictive demand modeling with behavioral supply chain analytics. I asked him if he had reviewed our current demand modeling system. He said he had been briefed on it. I pulled up the actual dashboard and walked him through it. He looked at the screen for a while and then said that it was impressive, but that we should be thinking more holistically. Ray, who had been with me for 11 years and could read my face better than most people read books, found me in the hallway after that meeting and said only, "How bad?" I told him we'd be fine if we kept our heads down and our numbers up. He nodded. He knew what I meant. We'd been through reorganizations before. We'd survived every single one by being too valuable to touch. What I didn't account for was how quickly the CEO's son would move once he felt established. He brought in a consultant named Tanner, who specialized in what he called supply chain disruption architecture, a title I have thought about many times since and still cannot fully parse. Tanner charged $22,000 for a 2-week engagement, during which he produced a report recommending that we consolidate 3 of our regional distribution hubs into one centralized facility, which would have added between 8 and 14 hours to our average delivery time for the hospital network we just spent 2 years landing as a client. I wrote a 12-page operational objection and submitted it through proper channels. The CEO's son told me he would take it under advisement. 2 weeks later, I saw that Tanner's recommendations had been presented to the board as the CEO's son's own strategic vision. He reorganized my senior team. He didn't fire them outright, he was too careful for that. Too aware of the optics, but he reclassified their roles, reduced their authority, moved them laterally into positions with impressive titles and no real function. Angela, my logistics director who had built our entire carrier network from scratch, was transitioned to a senior advisor of distribution strategy role that had no direct reports and no budget. Derek from procurement was assigned to a cross-functional innovation task force that met once and never met again. By June, I was the only person from my original leadership team still in a functional role. I had been at this company since the CEO's son was finishing high school. I kept running the operation. That's all I knew how to do. I held the carrier relationships together with phone calls I made at 6 in the morning before the office filled up with people who talked about innovation and didn't know the difference between a third-party logistics provider and a freight forwarder. I kept the hospital network happy with personal check-ins that the CEO's son would have called inefficient and that I called the reason our clients didn't leave. I protected the systems. I did what you do when someone is playing dress-up in an office above you while the real work happens below. The Fortune 50 hospital network contract was the thing that changed the numbers. I had been developing that relationship for 3 years. The procurement director, a woman who had been doing this job longer than I had watched us closely before she was willing to commit. She'd visited our facilities twice. She'd asked hard questions about cold chain compliance and HIPAA-adjacent data handling and emergency protocol escalation. I'd answered every one of them correctly because I actually knew the answers, and she knew I knew them. And that was the beginning of trust. When we finally landed the contract, it was the largest in our company's history. 42 hospital facilities, guaranteed 3-year term with a 5-year option. The CEO's son sent a company-wide email with the subject line Breakthrough. Strategic growth, initiative delivers major win. My name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. And only because someone in the legal department had apparently pushed back on a draft that didn't mention me at all. I printed that email. I put it in a folder in my desk drawer next to the operational authority agreement. By the end of Q3, our efficiency numbers were already in unprecedented territory. By October, I knew we were going to break 300%. By November, I had confirmed the clause with Sarah in legal, who had read the relevant language very carefully, and then said, in a voice that was doing its best to stay neutral, that she would prepare documentation. I told her to wait. She waited. In December, the CEO's son canceled the profit-sharing program, and I told her she could stop waiting. The board meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in January. The CEO's son sat at one end of the conference table. I sat near the middle. The board members, 4 of them, including 2 who had been with the company since the beginning, arranged themselves in the chairs around us. The founder appeared on the screen at the far end of the room, his face carrying the particular quality of a man who has been resting but has not stopped being sharp. He looked older than he had in the spring. The oxygen equipment was more visible than it had been before. But his eyes moved across that room the way they always had, taking inventory, understanding context, reading the thing under the thing. I presented the efficiency numbers first. 3 slides. The baseline forecast, the actual performance, the verified improvement percentage, 312%. The Ford Hospital Network contract, the error rate, the client retention numbers. I presented them without commentary because the numbers didn't need me to tell them what to mean. Then I presented the annex. Page 11 highlighted, the threshold, 275%. Our number, 312%. The founding shareholder's signature. One of the long-tenure board members looked at the document, then looked at the founder's face on the screen, and said nothing. He was the kind of man who understood that sometimes the right response to information is silence while you process it. The CEO's son started talking. He spoke about organizational evolution, about the limitations of legacy agreements in a modern operational context, about his own strategic vision for where the company was going, and why this kind of provision represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how authority structures should function in a growth-oriented enterprise. He spoke well. He always spoke well. He had spent his entire career learning how to sound like the most qualified person in any room, regardless of whether he was. When he finished, the room waited. His father looked at him through the screen for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "I wrote that clause myself. I put it in Marcus's agreement because I wanted to make sure that if he ever delivered something that extraordinary, he would have the standing to protect it. I didn't think he would actually get there. He did." The CEO's son opened his mouth. His father said his name, and the way he said it contained 31 years of complicated love and the specific disappointment of a man watching his son behave in a way he did not raise him to behave. Just his name. Nothing else. The CEO's son sat back. His father turned to me on the screen and asked what I was requesting. I had prepared for this question. I'd been thinking about the answer since the night in November when I'd first confirmed the clause, sitting alone in the building while the rest of the city went home. I'd thought about titles and authority and what I could ask for and what would actually fix the problem. I said I wanted 3 things. Operational autonomy for my department, with no external consultants engaged without my written approval. Reinstatement of the profit-sharing program at its original terms, retroactive for this fiscal year. And return of Angela and Derek to their original functional roles. That was it. No title, no seat at the executive table, no reorganization of the leadership structure. I just wanted the department back, my people back, and the promise we'd made to 63 employees honored. The founder said, "Done, all 3. He looked at his son again with something that wasn't anger exactly. It was closer to the look of a man adding information to a file he had been hoping wouldn't need to grow. He said, "I think you should take some time. Think about what kind of leader you want to be. We'll talk at the end of the month." The CEO's son left the meeting. He collected his leather notebook and his water bottle, and he walked out in a silence that had more volume than anything he'd said in the previous 2 hours. The board ratified the document. Sarah filed the paperwork before noon. By Thursday of that week, Angela was back at her desk. She didn't make a speech about it. She just sat down, pulled up her carrier network dashboard, and started working, and I watched her do it from my office window and thought about the 11 months she had spent in a role that was designed to sideline her without giving her a reason to leave. Derek came back on Friday. He walked into the operations floor at 7:45 in the morning with coffee for everyone who was already there, which was his way of saying what he didn't need words to say. The profit-sharing checks were distributed the following Wednesday, exactly as the program had always specified. Full amounts, covering the entire fiscal year, calculated against our actual performance numbers. I stood in the break room when they came out and watched people read the numbers and do the math in their heads, and I thought about the people who had quietly adjusted their financial plans when the announcement was made in December and were now quietly readjusting them back. Diane from warehouse management found me in the hallway after she opened her envelope. She didn't say anything. She just nodded in a particular way, the way people nod when words would be smaller than the thing they're trying to communicate. Tanner's consulting contract was not renewed. The innovation task force was dissolved. The strategic culture alignment sessions were removed from the calendar, which freed up approximately 4 hours per week for everyone who had been required to attend them. The CEO's son did not come back to the office after the board meeting. His transition was announced in a company-wide email 3 weeks later, a brief, carefully worded note from the founder that said his son had decided to pursue an independent venture and wished the company well. The reply chain from that email was 37 responses long and uniformly positive in a way that said everything about how people had been feeling for the previous 8 months. I called his father 2 days after the board meeting, not to discuss the business, I called because he had done something that I knew must have cost him, and I wanted him to know I understood that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had spent 31 years building something that worked because of people like me, and he was not going to watch it get broken by someone who hadn't yet learned the difference between authority and competence. He said he was proud of the year the team had delivered. He said he was sorry it had taken what it took to get us here. I told him we'd make it a bigger year. He laughed a real laugh, the kind he used to have before the health issues slowed him down. He said he believed me. I went back to work. 6 months later, the hospital network exercised their 5-year option, 8 months ahead of schedule. Our error rate held below 0.4% for the full second half of the fiscal year. Angela rebuilt 2 carrier relationships that had gone cold during the transition period. Derek's procurement restructuring saved us enough in vendor contracts to fund the 2 new analyst positions we'd been asking for since the previous year. Ray, who had been with me longer than anyone, and had watched all of it without saying much, found me one afternoon at the end of a long Tuesday and said that he thought the last 18 months had aged him a little. I told him that was honest. He said he also thought the last 6 months had been the best stretch of his career. I told him that was also honest. I got a LinkedIn notification in August. The CEO's son had launched a consulting firm focused on what his profile called next-generation organizational transformation and leadership culture architecture. His company had a clean, minimalist logo and a website with a lot of white space and language about disruption and vision. His connection count was growing. I scrolled past it, closed the app, and went back to the freight audit I was working on. There are people who learn the vocabulary of a business and people who learn the business. The vocabulary sounds like the business. It uses the same rooms and the same title cards and the same email signatures. From a distance, in a meeting where everyone is being careful, it is hard to tell the difference. But the difference is real, and it is large, and eventually, under sufficient pressure, it becomes impossible to hide. I spent 18 years learning this business. Every warehouse bay, every carrier lane, every hospital procurement officer who picks up the phone when I call, because we have never once let them down when it mattered. That is not something inherited or conferred. It is not contained in a degree or an org chart or an announcement about strategic vision. The clause is still in my operational authority agreement. The founder asked whether I wanted it removed once everything's settled, and I said no. He asked why. I said that some agreements mean more the second time around. He said he understood that. The machines in the warehouse run at 98% capacity. Our Q1 numbers are running 14% ahead of combined projections. 3 of my operations analysts have been promoted in the last 6 months to roles that would have taken them twice as long to reach in the old structure. The best revenge, I've come to understand, is not the moment when everything breaks open. It's not the board meeting or the document across the table or the silence after the founder says his son's name in that particular tone. Those moments feel significant because they are, but they're not where the real work is. The real work is the 18 years before. The carriers who trust you. The clients who renew early. The analysts who stay because they believe in the environment you've built. The operations floor that hums at 98%, not because anyone is watching, but because the people running it were hired right and trained right and treated like the professionals they are. That is what the CEO's son never understood and what his father built, and what I spent 18 years helping maintain. You cannot inherit competence. You cannot reorganize your way to it. You cannot title your way to it or consult your way to it or announce your way to it at a company-wide meeting with a strategic vision deck and your name in the subject line. You earn it or you don't. And the ledger always, eventually, balances.